and welcome, everyone. In this episode of Real Talk, you'll be hearing a bit of this.
They've been told 10 years ago that they talk too much or they're too bossy. But because that feedback is so fucking vague, they've just been in a perpetual state of paranoia ever since.
And a bit of that.
You know, if you're feeling that case of imposter syndrome, or not, as the case may be, you're maybe in a phase of learning, aren't you? It's getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
So in this episode, we have best-selling author, creative sociologist, public speaker, diversity activist and trailblazer, Amy Kean. Amy, how are you?
I'm all right.
Tell the truth.
I'm sick. But I'm going to be a trooper today.
Well, thank you very much for making your way up the M1 or the equivalent on the train.
I ran up the M1 just to be here.
Just to be here, yeah. Well, thank you for that. Also joining us is Seb Randle. He's a people-focused consultant and also head of allyship for the lovely Bloom North. He also founded The Helpful Space, which is a professional training consultancy helping young professionals understand their true value and leave self-doubt behind. That sounds very good. How are you, Seb?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So, Amy, what are we calling bullshit on today?
Today, we are calling bullshit on language and the double standards in language when it comes to how female leaders are described at work.
It's a biggie.
It's a huge one.
Big topic. Okay, so we're going to have a chat about this, but just before we get started, just wanted to remind everyone that we have access to a great tool during this conversation, which is our bullshit buzzer. And I'll just demonstrate for you.
Bullshit in oil too. So, that is a great tool.
Yeah.
You well described it.
So if any of us feel that we're going a bit off-piste and talking utter nonsense, make sure you hit that buzzer. Okay?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so going back to what you're calling BS on today, Amy, I know that you've studied a bit into the originations of language, haven't you?
So my best-selling book is called The Little Girl Who Gave Zero Fucks. And you won't be surprised to hear that I got a bit of slack. I got a bit of heat for that. And the Daily Mail ran a hate campaign against me, by the way, which is something I'm incredibly proud of. And The Spectator as well. It was on Joe Rogan's podcast. He hated it too. But the whole book is about what would happen if everyone worried less, which is, you know, kind of self-help to an extent. But when I was doing the promotion for that book, I researched the word fuck and its origins. And fuck is a religious term. So it's derived from the language of 16th century monks.
Well, there you go.
When we're thinking about the kind of language that can be applied to women in positions of power, it's just interesting to know why some words feel bad when you called them. So, like, for instance, if someone says, oh God, you so bossy, you instinctively know that doesn't feel great. But why? You know, have you looked into the word? Do you know anything about the word?
The word bossy?
Yeah.
Well, I think it comes down to the way that we talk about men and women for the most part. And I guess I'm a woman, you might also be the same, that I suppose people would call outspoken. Not because I think I'm particularly punchy, I'm just quite honest, I don't lie. But that's just one example of how women in society, even now, are narrated and judged negatively far more than men are. That's an unfortunate reality. So I'll give you an example. There was an audit conducted of something like 15,000 appraisals. An audit of the language that was used. And what it found was that 75% of women's appraisals used personal critique and personal language. The most popular term used was abrasive. 15% of men's appraisals featured any kind of personal critique. So you can see, obviously, society doesn't really like women who behave outside of the norm or are a little bit unruly. And so we use these terms, abrasive, bossy, bitchy, in order to get women to behave. And once you start to see that, you cannot unsee it.
And do you think that originally some of this has obviously come from the inequality between men and women, but do you think in some cases women can self-perpetuate these things to a degree, because certainly in my experience, some of the words we're talking about I've actually only ever been called by another woman, and some of it's quite playground as well. I wondered your thoughts on that, because generally I know in our business we tend to have quite supportive men, I think, especially given we have a 70% female board, so kind of have to be, don't they?
Nice, congrats. Have I noticed that it's women often perpetuating these stereotypes? For sure. Absolutely, 100%. I mean, the patriarchal system is one that both women and men subscribe to. And I think the reality is, if you look at the office or the workplace, it's a social situation. Like millennia ago, in the time of cave people, we were primarily focused on our actual survival. Are we going to get attacked by beasts? Are we going to live till tomorrow? That doesn't really apply anymore, particularly not in the UK. And so all we're preoccupied with is social survival. And for men and women, the best way to survive, even now, in that social situation of work, is to subscribe to patriarchal norms, even now. So in reality, and I don't know how you feel about this, some of the worst sexism I've received has been from women.
I was going to say the same. And then also, I think sometimes as individuals, we're guilty too, because I know I, up until today, possibly, have self-proclaimed to be bossy and not thought twice about it. And sometimes almost to the extent I've used it as my superpower in a situation where I've grown up working into and alongside men. Never had an issue with it. In fact, thrived probably because of it. But quite often my bossiness was the reason why they needed me in the room. And therefore I've probably played to that. And then when we were talking about this idea of the negative connotations of bossing, I looked up some of the actually directive and controlling, ignoring other people's perspectives, rude and pushy, micromanaging, being aggressive. I thought, God, I hope I'm not any of those things. Yeah, I've often talked about myself as being, kind of celebrating the fact I'm quite bossy.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether it's not just other women that can kind of perpetuate this. It's also that and us as individuals potentially playing to that kind of strength that has worked in a patriarchal situation.
Absolutely. Well, also, you do get a lot of women, senior women, saying, I'm the mum of the office. I didn't even really start to notice sexism in my life until my second job. So I worked in advertising for about 20 years. My first job was at a trade organisation, very soft, very lovely culture. It was only about 20 people strong, and we all had very specific jobs. And I didn't realise that sexism or bias at work was a thing because it didn't exist there. Everyone got on, everyone listened to each other, and it was lovely. And then as soon as I moved to advertising agencies, I was like, oh my God, why am I being interrupted all the time? Why am I getting treated like this? Why am I getting kicked out of projects for being too emotional? I'd never seen it or experienced it before. And I think if you're unlucky a couple of times, that can cloud your entire view of the professional world. And you start to see it maybe in places where it doesn't necessarily exist. But you start to assume that the entire world of work is against you, potentially as a female leader, for sure.
Yeah, and that's obviously not a place that anyone wants to be in. It's for both men and women in positions of leadership. A man should be able to show his emotional side more as a leader, and equally a woman should be able to be quite dominant and assertive if that's their style.
Yeah.
It's just no one should be actively trying to offend and upset anyone, really, should they? So
I guess it's about labelling in a way, isn't it? And that's, if we talk about what we're calling bullshit on, it's maybe not just particular language, it's actually labelling as a whole, isn't it? And
putting people in boxes, limiting them, it's okay to kind of speak up and be direct sometimes if on the flip side in another meeting maybe you're being compassionate and supportive. If you're railroading and you're just being that sort of demonstrative character all the time, then maybe people could have an issue with that. And that's, but in the wider context of, being a layered person who can offer all different types of support to people, then that's great.
Yeah. I do notice, so the company that I run, Good Shout, helps people communicate better at work in loads of different ways. And the one thing on the subject of labels that people grapple with the most is being professional. So everyone is obsessed with, I have to be professional at work. I have to come across as professional. But when you start to try and unpack that, no one has any idea what professional is supposed to mean. So I think you have a bunch of people at work of all genders trying to be the version of themselves that they think is the professional version of who they should be. And 90% of people are getting it wrong.
And it sounds kind of exhausting as well.
Yes.
Everyone's just going around, being their inauthentic self the whole time.
Well, I think often it stems to some like nugget of feedback that you have early on in your career, doesn't it? Like somebody saying to you something like, if you want to progress, you need to do a bit more of this or a bit less of that, which is terrible advice, really.
Was it personal?
Yeah, always personal. Never about be more organised or send better emails or manage people better. It's always down to a characteristic of some sort that largely probably constitutes a level of professionalism.
Normally what we see, because again, I train a lot of senior women who've been working for like 20, 30, 40 years, and they all come with baggage. And they've been told 10 years ago that they talk too much, or they're too bossy, or they're too cold, or all these really, really personal things. But because that feedback is so fucking vague, they've just been in a perpetual state of paranoia ever since, because no one's been able to explain it. And normally, if someone says you talk too much, generally means it's because they want to do the talking.
So true.
True.
Yeah.
And then it goes back to, I guess, your book in a way, which is like giving zero fucks. Like how much of this matters, how much of those sorts of labels or feedbacks or use of being told you're bossy or bitchy should matter versus actually going, if you guide your behaviour on respect, on compassion, on competence, on the things that matter as a leader, which ultimately is, it's not about you, is it? It's about the environment you're creating for people to be successful and the work to be amazing and all that kind of stuff, then should we actually just not care? Because that's somebody else's perception.
There's an element
as
of
opposed
that,
to
but I'm someone who is constantly looking to refine and improve and adapt. And I think, talking about my work at Blue North, I hadn't got an awareness for quite a lot of these things that we're talking about today until I put myself in an auditorium with 150 women and listened to, some panelists and some speakers in a space that was very sort of unfamiliar to me. And I started to see things from different vantage points, and suddenly all these questions were being raised in my own mind about how things should be or how things shouldn't be. And you can't just be the same person from the previous knowledge to this new awareness. You have to go, oh, hang on, maybe I need to question a few things that I've done historically. And that's exactly what I did. And so going back to what you were saying, I think in certain cases it's important to have the confidence not to care, but at the same time you've got to bring an awareness to situations, and if you feel that you can adapt and maybe that's the right thing to do, then you should think about it.
It's the hardest thing also to not care.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. I often post on LinkedIn, I don't think I am a bitch. But I often get the feedback that I'm too direct, people don't like my tone, etc. in a work capacity. And I often post on LinkedIn about it. Like, at what point is it going to be okay for a woman just to do a great job and not put loads of kisses at the end of her emails and sugarcoat everything? And every time I post something like that, I get hundreds of women saying, oh my God, me too, when am I going to escape this fucking social prison? And so but in theory, I shouldn't care, I should just crack on, I've got a job to do. But it's so hard when you're constantly getting this feedback. You always think, is it me though?
I find a funny one with work, and like going back to emails, you talking about you help people with emails. Because I have an androgynous name, I have actually seen that before people know who I am, it's quite interesting how I'll be spoken to on email, and then the surprise and the different approach I get when someone then finds out.
That's really
interesting,
isn't it?
That is, isn't it?
And it's some of the people in our business are putting pronouns on emails at the moment, which we're all very supportive of, but I don't actually want to, because I quite like the fact that
there was anonymity.
Are you the same regardless of who you're talking to? Or do you have some kind of gender bias there that you're not even aware of? So
there's a woman that I'm friends with, a trans woman called Cynthia, and Cynthia's at the kind of third part of her career. and was a very successful man for like 20 years, always in the boardroom, always at the most senior level, like incredibly successful and powerful, and then transitioned to become a woman. And she talks about this in talks, so I'm not like betraying her trust in any way, like really personal stuff. But she talks about how she is now treated so much differently. She has to ask male colleagues to repeat her ideas so that those ideas get signed off. She has become used to not quite being listened to in the same way. And it's fascinating because few people have that dual experience.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
But she said it's not until that happened that she was like, oh, God.
Yeah.
The experience is different. It's very, very different.
That is literally walking in the shoes of another, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was listening to a TED podcast. I can't remember it was a female speaker, and she'd done loads of research around advancement, I suppose, of the different genders in business. And she was saying that when you looked at, and it was sort of alluding to what you were saying about appraisals, the reason that women aren't necessarily getting into those C-suite positions is that they tend to be mentored and guided along the confidence and emotional control route. Just because, not because there's anything that they've necessarily done, it's just how women are managed. People tend to focus on that, whereas in men, the focus is a lot on understanding the commercials of the business. And that's why you tend to see this feeling of there being a glass ceiling, and it's nothing actually to do with capability. It's because women haven't necessarily been promoted because obviously when you want to get C-suite you need to understand the commercials of everything, and it's just a natural bias that seems to happen. I love your take on imposter syndrome. It just
just in case anyone hasn't seen it then, Amy, give us your take on imposter syndrome for the audience.
Doesn't exist. I think it's, so I've studied this a lot because I just think, oh, for God's sake, you hear all these people going, my imposter syndrome this, my imposter syndrome that. Stop it. I think, first of all, it's pop psychology. It's based on one teeny tiny qualitative research project in the 70s. The 70s isn't famous for its great psychological, sociological studies. It was kind of, it re-entered society or our conscious via Sheryl Sandberg. Don't trust her either, to be honest. But it was originally about how women of colour in senior positions sometimes feel like the system isn't quite as supportive of them as it is in the 70s. But now people have adopted it just as this sort of faux clinical syndrome. But actually, if you're feeling terribly insecure and massively out of your depth, first of all, maybe you are.
Yeah.
Second of all, it's everything to do with your environment. Our brains, we're not born feeling less. See if you unleashed me now. But I just, what do you think, Seb?
You're in sort of, if you're feeling that case of imposter syndrome, or not, as the case may be, you're maybe in a phase of learning, aren't you? You're it's getting comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a syndrome. Crikey, what a word to use. It's, we all feel out of our depth at times, and it's normalizing these things to think, I'm learning, I'm in a new situation, I'm dealing with a different group of people. Why should that be, oh my God, I can never do this because of X, Y, Z. It's unhelpful. It's an unhelpful diagnosis. So
I guess some of it's fear of failure, isn't it? Which is what we're talking about from a female perspective in particular, that if you're doing something that maybe you feel like you haven't got permission to do, then it's doubly hard to fail in it. Maybe that's where a lot of this stems from.
There is this sort of fakery and sort of winging it. I think people feel that they're winging it a lot, and I think a lot of that is down to things moving at pace. Our industry moves at pace, and people often just don't get quite deep into stuff because before you know it, things are changing again. A business is going in a different direction, or you've got to respond to things very, very quickly, and that naturally makes people feel a bit insecure and a bit like, I don't know what I'm doing here, therefore I've got imposter syndrome. Well, no, you're the product of what is essentially a very fast moving industry. So, slow things down, get a bit of focus, like reflect on your qualities or your successes and try and use that to fuel what it is you want to do.
I love how you said that.
I do
That's
too.
great.
We should have recorded it.
Yeah, I wasn't listening to a word of it, but it looks nice.
So, obviously, you've come on to talk about the tricky language that
Yes.
revolves around females in positions of leadership. And I just wondered your thoughts on, there seems to be a whole movement of, it might be social groups or it might be training courses, etc., about being things like a girl boss or a girl boss with no eye, like a sort of tiger sort of thing.
I think feminism has become an industry, and the result of that is jumpers that say smash the patriarchy and socks that say girl boss, and the pink capitalism of even the Barbie film. I enjoyed it. I did actually go to the cinema twice to watch it, but it's still a capitalist entity. They made billions with this shiny, feisty, faux activist feminism that isn't real. It's just about making money. And I think the girl boss era is very white, and it's the perfect demonstration of that. Feminism is an ideological movement that's supposed to move the needle. Girl boss terminology doesn't. It's safe, it's nice, it's completely inoffensive, and that's not what any kind of activism is supposed to be.
In terms of this sort of negative language that can be applied to women, what do we think we can actually do about this? Because obviously we'd like people who are listening to also come away from this with maybe some thoughts on how you tackle it. We've obviously talked about, is it that you just have to take the power away from the word? I don't know, what do you think is the best way to try to drum out some of this, words like bossy and bitchy being used?
I like the word unlearn, and it's used a lot these days in DEI. That's my DEI conversations. And I think it might become a bit of a cliche soon, but I think it's really nice if you do genuinely want to make the workplace lovely for everyone. You do have to unlearn the language that you use, how you listen to people, because there's a lot of bias that goes on when we listen to different types of people, and also the assumptions you make about people's intentions. I think all of those things, at Good Shout we talk about mindful speaking, actually being really, really conscious of every single word that comes out of your mouth, because every single word that you use has a power and could affect someone. I think that would be lovely if we all started doing that a bit more.
Just acknowledging what's truly happening in the room, and also, going to the sort of active part of calling in behaviours is something that I really like, as opposed to calling out.
I think people are a bit weary of being told off. There was a kind of wonderful phase when we were calling shit out, and maybe it did get a bit too intense, and I think maybe that phase is over now. I think everyone's starting to understand that we need to just assume that everyone's human, trying their best, and the ones that aren't trying their best, you're never going to win over, so just let them fucking sit in their corner and be bigots. But we have to assume that most people do actually want to be better.
Okay, so I think it's a topic we clearly can and have talk about for ages, but essentially I think we all agree that no woman, or man for that matter, should need to jump through hoops in order to receive fair and equal treatment in the workplace and in life. How someone's characteristics are described should have nothing to do with gender. So a big thank you to our guests today, Seb and Amy. I think we're all in agreement that Amy was absolutely right with what she brought to call BS on. And we'll catch you on our next Real Talk.